Hello Brain Shakers, Brave LST is here from the Brain Shakers Academy. Now, we did look at the fetal circulation and some of those temporal structures that are created during fetal life. But then what happens after birth? What happens to those structures? Let's get to find out. So basically, there's a process that we call the closure of the structures. Now, in the closure of the temporal structures, they are closing in two forms. Then there's number one, what we call functional closure. It means that in their functionality, their function has actually expired, and so they have to transition into something else, because we are transitioning now from the fetal circulation going into postnatal circulation, and then their function now is no longer required, so we have to change their term. And then after the functional closure, there is also what we refer to as anatomical closure. Now, when we're looking at anatomical closure, this means that now that part that had been created temporarily now has to transition and change into a different form. Now, we discussed a number of those important elements or temporal structures. Number one, we did talk about the ductus venosus, and number two, we talked about the formation of the foramen ovale, and number three, we also talked about the ductus arteriosus, and then number four, we also talked about the umbilical vessel, which was the vein and the arteries. Now, let's quickly look at what happens to the ductus venosus. We did look at the inferior vena cava, which we called the IVC, and within the inferior vena cava, it gave rise to that umbilical vein. So this is our umbilical vein. Now, the umbilical vein is collecting all the blood that is emanating from the placenta and bringing the oxygenated blood to the inferior vena cava, thereby giving us that temporal structure which we called the ductus venosus. Now, this ductus venosus was being kept open because of the high pressure of the blood also that is coming from the umbilical vein into the inferior vena cava. And once you have now clamped and cut the cord, it means that the supply that is coming from the umbilical vein reduces in pressure, and so the pressure there is going to reduce, forcing this temporal structure to then close, because what is going to be moving in the inferior vena cava now will have higher pressure than the pressure that is being created or generated from the umbilical vein, and this is going to close. And that is the almost immediate functionality that will happen. Now, it means that is going to be functional closure, but then anatomical closure will usually occur in about 1 to 3 months of life. Now, once that has then closed and then it goes on into anatomical closure, it will transition into what we call ligamentum. It means that it becomes a ligament, so it will then transition into what we call ligamentum venosum. So it becomes a ligament. So there's going to be a ligament there that is going to form. So the structure itself will be called ligamentum venosum. Now, with the obliterated umbilical vein, then what is going to happen is that this also turns into a ligament, and it will be called ligamentum teres. Okay, so the umbilical vein will now change its name to ligamentum teres. So it has been obliterated, and it then remains now as a ligament. Then you have the umbilical arteries on the other end also. Once you have clamped, because when you clamp the umbilical cord, it means that you have clamped also the umbilical arteries. So the umbilical arteries will then change into medial umbilical ligaments. Okay, so they will be called medial umbilical ligaments. Okay, So they all turn now and become ligaments. Okay, so now we have looked at what happens to the ductus venosus. Okay, and then we have looked at what happens to the umbilical artery. Now let's quickly look at what happens to the foramen ovale. So the foramen ovale, we did say that it was a connection between the right atrium and the left atrium. So we have the left atrium here and we have the right atrium. Obviously this will be the right ventricle and then the left ventricle. So it's that connection here which is going to be called the foramen ovale. Now, blood was circulating to the right atrium and then having its way into the left atrium. So why all this was happening is it has to do a bypass because the lungs are not functioning as areas of oxygenation or areas of respiration. So meaning that everything that the lungs were supposed to be doing was being conducted by the placenta, and so there's a bypass of the lungs for facilitation of oxygenated blood from the right side to the left side and then supplied to the rest of the body. And so what was happening is you have a higher pressure in the right atrium as compared to what you have in the left ventricle, thereby keeping that primum also open, and so there is then flow of blood into the left atrium. But once the resistance in the pulmonary arteries and in the pulmonary vessels has then been reduced, it means that the lungs take up their functionality of oxygenating blood and then now allows blood back through to the left atrium. So the pressure now in the left atrium becomes high, and as it becomes high, it means that it will facilitate for the closure also of the foramen ovale. If the foramen ovale remains patent or remains open still, it will end up giving you a condition that we call a patent foramen ovale. Okay, so basically that is what is going to happen to the foramen ovale, and once the foramen ovale now has closed and then changes its term, it will be referred to as a fossa ovalis. Okay, so we would refer to it as a fossa ovalis. So all these temporal structures that are created, they are changing after their functional transformation. Then they go or they undergo what is known as anatomical transformation, and basically just being transformed into ligaments, and they remain as ligaments unless if the structure has failed to then close. That's when you have a patent shunt. So we have looked at the foramen ovale. Now let's look at what happens to the ductus arteriosus. So in the ductus arteriosus, we did talk of having our pulmonary artery, and then obviously you have that aorta there with your vessels on top there. Okay, then you have now this shunt that is connected, or an opening here that is connecting the pulmonary artery and the aorta, and usually almost close to the left subclavian artery there. So the closure of this ductus arteriosus is going to be facilitated by the first inspiration. So when at birth there's that first inspiration, it then sends oxygen. So the pulmonary artery has what we call receptors. So within it, those receptors are sensitive to oxygen. But during fetal life, you have elements that we call prostaglandins. Okay, the PGEs, so prostaglandins, and importantly for this particular function of suppressing the receptors within the pulmonary arteries, you have a prostaglandin E2, and then you have 12, and then you also have prostaglandin F2A. So these three are cardinal in making sure that the receptors within the pulmonary arteries there are suppressed during a fetal life. But at the moment that there is now inspiration, that means at birth, when there is inspiration, the receptors, we did make mention that they're actually sensitive to oxygen. So that inspiration of that first inspiration then sends oxygen. It means that there is also going to be another element that is produced from the lungs that we call bradykinin. Okay. Okay, now bradykinin is very important to come and fight the functionality of the prostaglandins, meaning that it counteracts the effect of the prostaglandins and stops the prostaglandins from suppressing those receptors, so that then the receptors are expressed, and because they're sensitive to oxygen, their nature is that they are going to bind to that oxygen or respond to the oxygenation, and then allow now the tunica media to then contract. The muscular layer of the pulmonary arteries within the tunica media allow it to contract, and it is the contraction now of that tunica media, or the muscular layer, that is then going to cause the functional closure of the ductus arteriosus. So it is the functionality of the first inspiration that gives you oxygen, and also the release of bradykinin from the lungs that will facilitate the closure of the ductus arteriosus. And this ductus arteriosus now, it will then be transformed. Once it undergoes anatomical closure, it will then be transformed into what you call a ligamentum arteriosum. Okay, so it remains as a ligamentum arteriosum. So there are times when there is failure of all these processes to facilitate the closure, and then you end up with a patent ductus arteriosus. So when you end up with a patent ductus arteriosus, it means there's then going to be a reverse of the flow of blood, and you may end up with pulmonary hypertension. So most of the structures that are then created during the fetal life will end up becoming ligaments, and when they become ligaments, then the correct flow of blood is going to be permitted, and the lungs are now functional, meaning that blood will be permitted to get through to the lungs and then will be brought back to the left atrium, and then the process also continues. So basically that's what happens to those temporal structures that were created. They're only created to come and facilitate the whole process of fetal circulation, and once the baby has then been born, all those temporal structures will have to be closed down, and they are converted into ligaments. There are plenty of ligaments in the body, and so they continue to serve as the complex anatomy of the cardiovascular system, or the heart in itself. So basically that's what happens. And if you found this particular video helpful in understanding the changes that happen to the temporal structures and also about the fetal circulation, don't hesitate to give me a thumbs up. Please do make sure you share as much as possible, and also be a follower and also subscribe to my YouTube channel, which is Brain Shakers Academy. And from me, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.